Okay, folks, welcome to this first session. We had a very interesting opening with the Speaker of Parliament establishing some very fundamental points about the role of Parliament in its oversight and monitoring of SDGs. We also had various speeches like Tan Sri Michael Yeo and our APPG chairperson, who also spoke and gave a brief overview of SDGs as a whole. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were launched by the United Nations and accepted by 193 countries in September 2015, was also a policy endorsed by the Malaysian government then, and subsequently the Malaysian government through the midterm review, even the 11th plan, and now has had a very strong emphasis on SDGs, localizing, and so forth. We heard about the all-party parliamentary group on sustainable development goals. It's a group of parliamentarians with multi-stakeholder engagement, including civil society, as well as academics and private sector individuals who have been part of the group. And we were the first of the APPGs set up, but subsequently Parliament has set up one on refugees, as well as another on detention centers and the issues, especially in the context of COVID, overcrowding and so forth. So on the APPG SDG program, some points were raised just now. But the session today has a sort of a balancing role of looking at the global progress and development, because this agenda, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, is not just for developing countries or poor countries. It's for all the countries of the world, and it was recognized that even in advanced democracies and more developed nations, what tended to be called the first world, there is also large amount or numbers of the poor, inequality, issues of discrimination and so forth. So the SDGs is applied across all the countries of the world, and the UN set up a global process, which is then called the High-Level Political Forum, which took place every year, except last year. We are not sure this year whether New York is cleared for people to travel and meet, but a lot of discussions have been online, and that's liberalized or opened up the conversations at the global level. So one picture that the UN resident coordinator, Mr. Stefan, would present is the global progress, achievements, challenges, best practices, and the issues. So we get a big picture of the world. Maybe he might highlight Asia Pacific or what. And then we have the Economic Planning Unit representative, Kode, who is the Director of Environment and Natural Resources in EPU, to highlight more the national level, more domestic issues of achievements. Since 2015, the government adopted it, 2016, 17, 18, 19. So there's almost 5 years, and it's been period of the 11th Malaysia Plan, and moving now into the 12th Malaysia Plan. And Malaysia has gone through 2017 voluntary national review in 2017. And this year in 2021, Malaysia would undertake a review again. So among the speakers, I don't know whether I said it or I was advised to make it like a conversation, but we seem a bit far away for a sort of a conversation rather than paper presentations. So there will be 3 rounds of questions and discussion, after which we will open it up depending on the time. And I think the organizers will advise us on the timing, how much is available, but you will have an opportunity to ask a question or make a comment. So please note it down so that when the time comes, you'll have an opportunity to do it. So the round one, which is more a global for Mr. Stefan, is global performance and achievements at the global level. How is it at the global level? It was moving fast, then COVID came. Is it in the back burner now? Is it forgotten by the countries of the world? Is it still progressing well? So I'll pass the time. Let's give a hand to Mr. Stefan, who is the resident coordinator, who will provide a first round of global reflections.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Mic is on. Thank you very much, Dr. Denison, and greetings to all of you. As Dr. Denison said, this is supposed to be a conversation, and I wish I would see you without masks, but I'm very well aware that it's better that you have masks. I think for me, it's also, again, being back in physical kind of conferences, a big pleasure. It's a very special occasion for me, in fact, I have to tell you, after a year of Zoom meetings, which I think we all enjoyed the first 3 ones, but we're a little bit kind of frustrated in the next 1,000 ones. Let me start by kind of congratulating the organizers for this important conference. And I'd also like to, in absentia, greet Datuk Azhar Harun, who I really gave a fantastically inspiring speech. Linking Parliament and parliamentary oversight and parliamentary engagement to the achievement of these Sustainable Development Goals. I think this is something that cannot be taken for granted. Executive branches around the world, of course, work on the achievement of SDGs, but Parliament is not everywhere engaged. So it's really kind of appreciated that Parliament is engaged. I also would like to greet Datuk YB Rohani, the chairwoman of APPG, because you so beautifully have presented basically the work of the all-party parliamentary group. And I feel a little bit very associated, in fact, with your group. Dr. Denison will remember we had a conference in late 2018 in the Parliament to kind of link the role of parliamentarians with the SDGs, and I was honored to speak there and give some good practices of other countries, how parliamentarians can get engaged. And I think by now APPG is a much more important example than many of the examples that I at that time presented. Finally, let me also say a warm hello to my really long-standing partner, Dr. Denison, in terms of the SDG promotion. I think what you've done is really incredible in terms of bringing together the NGOs and now also basically supporting Parliament. And last but not least, Mr. Che. Obviously, EPU is the driver behind the SDGs, from government point of view. So I think we have really representatives from many important constituencies. I'd like to start with 4 key line messages in terms of trying to answer where we are with regard to the achievement of global achievement of SDGs. My first message is that the current policy discourse is dominated by COVID-19, which, as you know, is a global health emergency that triggered a socio-economic crisis, and that there is real danger that the SDGs get lost in these immediate imperatives. And therefore, I would like to recall, and I think it has been done in various ways already today by different speakers, how fantastic, how powerful the vision of the SDGs really is. Not only has it been endorsed by all United Nations member states, but it also presents the most comprehensive and thought through picture of development that there ever was globally. Everybody knows about the tripartite structure of social, economic, and environmental development, and the effort of achieving a balance between these three dimensions. But the SDGs are more than that. They talk about inequality. They talk about gender equality. Rather, not, they talk about inequality, but they, of course, seek to achieve increased equality, including gender equality. They talk about protecting human rights. They talk about building peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. These are dimensions that sometimes are not as much at the forefront. And only if you appreciate the holistic vision, I think, then you can really say that we move forward, in a robust manner. And I'm saying this because the picture is not equal for all the dimensions. We have done well in some dimensions, we have done not so well in others. My second message is to recall that even before COVID hit, the achievement of SDGs, and no doubt set them back, there was already, through measurements, and I will come in a moment how difficult these measurements of SDGs is, a perception that we are falling behind. The 2019 report to the Secretary General basically came up with various shortfalls. And therefore, the Secretary General called in early 2020 for a decade of action, for a decade of enhanced action, bringing together all the important actors, governments, civil society, multilateral organizations, private sector. So it was not that we were fully on track before the COVID crisis. And I'll come in a moment, how the progress basically looked relatively in different dimensions. My third message is that the COVID-19 crisis actually makes the SDGs more relevant, not less relevant. The framework is not only valuable for governments, but also it is important to really kind of make that link to the longer term. I mean, let's only think about the COVID-19 crisis. It showed us our intimate link to nature. After all, the disease originated from wildlife trafficking. Probably we don't know yet for sure, but it originated from wildlife trafficking, and it paralyzed the world. It showed us during the crisis, I mean, that is my observation living in Bukit Antara Bangsa, how blue the sky above Kuala Lumpur can be. It showed us how precious our freedoms are, how integral freedoms are to development. I mean, the lack of freedom of movement and many other freedoms that were, of course, originating from the crisis, I think, in an unprecedented way, showed that the SDG paradigm is the right way forward. And it also demonstrated many policy gaps that need to be addressed now, basically, after COVID. It's not yet after COVID, but hopefully there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And that is bringing me to my fourth message. My fourth message is that COVID-19 also presents opportunities. It is a crisis, and if you look at history, it has always been in crisis where humankind came together and came up with the most reforms to address, some of the losses that were suffered during that crisis. So we call it, and you all know that term, building back better. And what does building back better mean? It means fixing the policy gaps that we have experienced in terms of social inclusion, in terms of environmental protection, and others. And I think that this session comes at a fantastic time because we are really at a time of stock taking. The government at the moment presents its second voluntary national review and is working hard on finalizing the substance, to kind of really give a robust stock taking of what was done and what needs to be done. Therefore, I think, these discussions are very, very important. Now, if I have a little bit of time more, I'd like to say about how we kind of can gauge the progress. One of the big achievements of the SDGs is the very robust data monitoring framework. As you all know, we have 17 goals, but we have 169 targets and 232 or 231 unique indicators. And these indicators were agreed upon globally, and is a complex framework, which means that not all the countries have yet, I think, the data sets available, to fully kind of give a picture of how they are doing against the goals. And that makes my answer very, very difficult. Even before COVID, we had, data sets that were incomplete, but we can broadly say that in terms of poverty reduction and in terms of the social goals, health, education, we did relatively better, although, as I said, the progress was too slow. We did not very well in terms of moving forward on increased equality. We did not very well in terms of moving forward in terms of gender equality. And we did very, very poorly in terms of moving forward with the environmental goals and with part of the targets of SDG 16, the governance goals. Now, these incomplete data sets, of course, have now then been impacted by COVID. And to gauge a really kind of scientific or quasi-scientific picture of after COVID SDG kind of situation, I think is even more difficult because the data sets have not been yet updated with the year 2020. I think you probably will say for Malaysia something similar, that most of the data are from 2019. 2020 is too recent. What we know is that from World Bank analysis that there is positive economic recovery, but global poverty will still rise in the short term. And it will reverse dramatically a long-term trend. One of the most proud achievements, I think, of the development of the world was this incredible figure since 1990 that about 100,000 people per day were lifted out of poverty. So for the first time in 2020, this was reversed. UNDP's post-COVID Human Development Index suggests significant impacts on health and educational standards, which we don't know yet, how they will impact long-term development. This stems from the fact that because of the preoccupation with COVID, many other patients could not be possibly treated adequately, which could have a long-term impact on life expectancy. School closures. What does this mean in terms of the educational and the psychological damage for kids, for children that basically then will enter the job market in 5 or 10 years? This is simply not known yet. So I can, if there's specific questions, I can get into certain indicators afterwards. But broadly, I think that's the picture. Social progress okay until 2019, but catastrophically set back by COVID, and environmental goals very, very significantly behind. Goal 13, climate change, even fell further behind. In the environment, climate change goal is sometimes quoted as a positive impact of COVID because for some time carbon emission, as you all know, were reducing by 20 or 70 to 20% globally. But we all know that this was a very short-term impact, and unless significant policies will put it into place to fix the kind of development as we had it before, that was very carbon intensive, we will not have any significant improvement in the long term. So I'll stop it with that for the time being and hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Stefan, for providing a comprehensive overview, the impact of COVID, looking at some of the impact nationally, but really looking at the global achievements on one end, but also recognizing the impact of COVID and the negative aspects. Now I'll pass the time on to Che Kode, who is representing EPU. He likes to do a PowerPoint presentation, and I think that visual might be helpful to us at this time to document the data and analysis and progress. So I thought, I was just reminded by Woon that although we started late, time is passing because there is sessions after us as well. So after Che Kode's presentation, I'll open to a few Q&A. If there is no Q&A, then I'll ask the questions I had prepared rather than dominate the discussion. Che Kode, let's give a hand to our EPU, the anchor of and the lead agency for SDGs in Malaysia. Over to you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning to all participants. Terima kasih Datuk for allowing me to speak from here. Yang berbahagia Tan Sri Michael Yeo, Organizing Chairman Malaysia Sustainability Leadership Summit, and the President of KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific, as well as Chairman for ProHam. Yang berbahagia, Yang Berhormat Datuk Seri Rohani Abdul Karim, Chairman for All Party Parliamentary Group Malaysia, Member of Special Independent Committee on Emergency 2021, Mr. Stefan, UN Resident Coordinator for Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei and Brunei Darussalam, and Datuk Moderator, Datuk Dr. Denison Jayasooria, Head of the Secretariat for All Party Parliamentary Group Malaysia on SDG. First of all, on behalf of EPU, I would like to express our sincere thanks to KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific for excellent preparation and event this morning. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our involvement in SDG initiative began a few years ago when Malaysia, along with 192 world leaders, adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 goals during the United Nations General Assembly in New York on 25th of September 2015. Okay, sustainable development has always been at the heart of Malaysia development approach. Since gaining independence in 1957, Malaysia has consistently taken into account the economic, social and environmental dimension into our Malaysia Development Plan. Malaysia's journey towards sustainable development intensified in 1970s when the new economic policy to eradicate poverty and restructure societal imbalance was launched. All subsequent 5 years National Development Plan have emphasized the element of sustainable development. This is through promoting sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth and equitable distribution to all sections of society, a safe and sound community, well-paying jobs, quality education, affordable house, and mainstreaming of environmental conservation. Therefore, Malaysia is not starting anew on its pathway to sustainable development, but simply continue to align of a process already in a motion for decades. By design, Malaysia development policy have always reflected the SDG spirit of inclusivity in one way or another for over few decades now. Thus, it is easier for us to embed the sustainable development goal within existing development planning mechanism compared to some other country who may not have the requisite institutional set up to fully take on board the SDG. So I will skip this slide. The alignment of SDG and national development is realized through a mapping exercise, involve the integration of the national development plans, action plans, initiative and outcome of the SDG goals, targets and indicators. The mapping exercise begins with the 11 Malaysia Plan from 2016 to 2020, then continue with midterm review of 11 Malaysia Plan since 2018 to 2020, and subsequently with the upcoming 12th Plan for 2021 and 2025, and the upcoming 13 Malaysia Plan for 2026 and 2030. Malaysia recognized that a comprehensive implementation of SDG will require the mobilization of resources, particularly financing. Since the implementation of SDG in Malaysia are aligned with 5 years National Development Plan, SDG expenditure utilize the government development budget as well as the operating expenditure. In 2020 budget announcement, Ringgit Malaysia 5 million has also been allocated to support the convening of Parliamentary Select Committee meetings and also for greater engagement with civil society, which include to address the SDG at local level. The government continue to support strategic projects through financing program under Bank Pembangunan Malaysia Berhad, offering a 2% interest subsidy per annum via Sustainable Development Financing Fund size increase from 1 billion in 2019 to Ringgit Malaysia 2 billion in 2020. In response to the COVID pandemic, Malaysia government has issued several economic stimulus package, namely Prihatin, Penjana and Permai, to counter the economic impact of pandemic. The package implement strategies that include spurring economic growth, promoting investments, and encouraging businesses to adopt automation and digitalization in their processes. Cash transfer were given to the household and single individual in B40 and M40 groups. This is an overview of SDG initiative for the past 5 years. 2019 was our active years. We participate at the international SDG related meeting in the regional and at the international level, and subsequently organized Malaysia SDG Summit in November 2019 at Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre. In support of the global monitoring and reporting of the SDG 2030 agenda, Malaysia took pride in presenting a voluntary national review at the 2017 Global High-Level Political Forum and is committed to undertake broader country reporting every 4 years. With the support of United Nations country team and Mr. Stefan, Malaysia will present the second voluntary national review report at the High-Level Political Forum scheduled to be July this year. These are the snapshot of progress of our achievement thus far. We have achieved commendable progress, particularly in poverty eradication for SDG 1, no poverty, and SDG 2, zero hunger. Based on poverty line income 2019, at national level of Ringgit Malaysia 2,208 ringgit. The incidence of absolute poverty declined from 7.9% in 2016 to 5.6% in 2019. The incidence of absolute poverty in rural area was 12.4%, while in the urban area was at 3.8% in 2019. Based on the international poverty line at USD $1.9, incidence of poverty was almost eradicated since 2016. In regard to SDG 8, which is Sustainable Economic Growth and Decent Work, an important indicator on prosperity dimension, namely the annual growth rate of real GDP per annum, per capita recorded an increase from 3.6% in 2016 to 3.9% in 2019. The SDG 8 is also on improving labor efficiency and productivity. One of the breakthrough in SDG implementation is the amendment of the labor laws. Under the 11th plan, amendments were made to several laws pertaining to labor, and this will help to strengthen the labor market and improve the right of workers. The Industrial Relations Act 1967 has been revised to expedite decision making by delegating the power of the minister and reducing the discretionary power of Director General, while the Employment Act 1955 and Trade Union Act 1959 are being amended to ensure that both are at par with the international standards. The introduction of Self-Employment Social Security Act 2017 will also help to improve labor market efficiency. So, ladies and gentlemen, government alone are not able to implement SDG effectively. It takes all stakeholders, from individual to organization, a whole of nation approach to accelerate the implementation of SDG. As a way forward, we would like to encourage for all stakeholders to intensify efforts and more SDG localization program at the grassroots level to be implemented. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Okay, thank you very much, Chekode. I think you presented a comprehensive presentation drawing on from the midterm review and the way in which the development planning directly identified correlating aspects of SDGs, economic, social, environmental, and you did some assessment of the progress, and I think more fuller reports will come out from the VNR process, and civil society and parliamentarians have been engaging both the UN and the EPU on the VNR review process as it stands. Now, the difficulty we are having is, I think we started late, so I'm under pressure to pass on the time. But because I'm the moderator, I'll see whether if there's anyone who wants to ask a question or two, if you can say who you are, and because you'll have a unique opportunity, you have the UN representative and EPU in the same room, so don't miss this chance. Anyone? Going? I say very passive group. Impact of, Mr. Stefan said, the impact of COVID, because semua tutup mulut. So tidak ada soal. Yes, one there, a young brave man. If you can say your name, come to the mic please quickly. We can take one or two questions and a brief intervention from both the speakers. Yes.
Good morning, speakers and Dr. I'm Francis from Bank Pembangunan.
Yes.
Just a quick question for Dr. Dr. Stefan, actually. Doctor, you mentioned just now about the COVID-19 provided opportunities as well. But I'd just like to understand, we have another, 9 years to reach our SDG goals, that is 2030, as highlighted by Kodir. So the question now is, based on current reviews that's being done, and also in terms of what needs to be done next, how confident are we that we will actually arrive in 2030 and achieve all the SDG goals? And if we don't, what will be some of the concerns that we need to address now in order to get to our targets by 2030? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Francis. Anyone else with a pressing question or a comment? Okay, I'll give both speakers an opportunity. I'll start with Mr. Stefan, and you can say something else with that as well, and then to Inchikod.
Thank you for this question, Francis. I think you rightly said we have 9 years to go. That's not a lot of time. And I think if the people would probably kind of, evaluate this question, the answer different but let me kind of give you my point of view, my assessment. I think it is very unlikely that we will achieve all the Sustainable Development Goals. Certainly, globally, is very unlikely. It's very unlikely in terms of the environmental goals, because the change of policies will take too long. But let's also kind of acknowledge that the SDGs are a supremely ambitious vision. And it is important, I think, that there will be a vast kind of difference between different countries. As Denison said at the very start, the beauty of this paradigm is that it basically is subscribed by the whole world. So, you know, so-called advanced countries in Europe are adopting it as well, are using it as a lens to budget resources for certain policy priorities as do least developed countries. So I think we will have a huge kind of range of achievements from countries such as Sweden that at the moment lead the pack in terms of SDG achievements, to other countries that due to conflicts will not probably progress at all. Because one, I think, issue that is very clearly outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals is the fact that peace, good governance, and the achievement of sectoral policy goals are deeply related. That is the SDG 16, which I think is one of the key innovations in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. So my assessment is that we will not achieve all the goals. But I think 9 years are long enough to come in with significant policy changes to counter the, let's say, time lag that we had until 2019, and the further kind of setback through COVID. Now, if I may, I mean, there are some. I'd like to kind of quote perhaps some good practices that countries have adopted to accelerate the achievement of SDGs. I think one of it, and I think Malaysia has been good at that, is to really recognize it as the planning agenda and the budgeting agenda. The SDGs, cover all dimensions of development, and they cannot be seen as some side agenda. So if you are mobilizing budgetary and planning resources as a country and aligning your own goals with the SDGs, use the SDGs as aspirations to further fine-tune your own goals, then I think you are much more likely to achieve these transformational goals. But it goes beyond public sector financing. The bigger, I think, challenge is to crowd in the resources of private sector. Because as was also mentioned in the opening session, we estimate that the private sector has about 45% of the resources required that can be mobilized to achieve the SDGs. And there, I think we need to come in, and there's again a role, I think, of government with incentives to bring private sector in. I think the most important incentive that I see, again, looking at the different achievements with regard to different goals, is to build environmental costs into the economic model through a mix of taxes and incentives, potentially also subsidies. So you have a carrot and stick approach, to align the private sector, because I know that there are private sector leaders in the room that are very committed to the SDGs, but I think that cost-benefit analysis will always be important for any businessman. And therefore, you have to change this cost-benefit ratio to really kind of bring the private sector on board in bulk. And a good example of that would be, for example, the European Green Deal, which invests public sector resources, but relies on cost sharing of the private sector to achieve the goals. Very simple example. We have this for a long time. We have about 100, sometimes 100% tax rate on fuel, because fuel produces carbon emissions. And that's why those that benefit from using fuel should also pay for the environmental costs. And what has this led to in, let's say, European economies? Has led to a very kind of judicious use of your car and a shift to public sector transport, which is much more carbon efficient. And it has led on the producer side to producing much more fuel efficient cars. Now you have engines that only need, 3 liters of fuel for 100 kilometers. 20 years ago, it still needed 10 liters. So you have basically this inbuilt incentive to really bring environmental costs into the economic model. And I think that this is one of the biggest, challenges and one of the biggest potentials to change that policy direction after COVID. It is not good enough to say we have now, immediate needs that we need to finance, and environment is a long-term issue. Science tells us that the COVID impact was tiny in comparison to what will expect us through climate change and biodiversity degradation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Stefan. Cik Kode, your input to that question as well.
Terima kasih Datuk, and terima kasih for Mr. Francis from Bank Pembangunan Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, just now during the break, we have just talking with our friend. I'm talking with my friend. Actually, SDG is everything under the sun. So we noticed that, kan? So actually, achieving SDG require appropriate and timely policy action and funding. And with regard to the government, from the government perspective, government have a very limited funding very limited funding. So if I were to take one example, so flood mitigation for example, so one project of flood mitigation may require 500 million up to 1.5 billion ringgit Malaysia. So this is a very huge amount of money, and government are not able to fund all flood mitigation project, all the countries, in all portion of the countries. So on top of flood mitigation, government also have responsibilities to provide a good education, health care services, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the challenges facing by the government right now. So on top of that, we from the government, so we'll work very hard, and we committed at our best level to achieve where possible the target as stated by SDG. And from stakeholder point of view, I also would like to draw your attention for us to act as a citizen at our level best to support government, to support all stakeholders to achieve the SDG. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Stefan, 1 minute. You wanted to say something? Do you want to? Or just 1 minute. Okay.
Very stuff. I just wanted to also kind of use the opportunity to kind of highlight the potential of multilateralism and give an example. And the example that I would like to present is the COVAX facility. You all know about COVAX, where the issue to be addressed was the vastly different purchasing power of different countries, and the worry of the United Nations that the rich countries would kind of buy all the vaccines and leave nothing for the poor countries. So therefore, the COVAX facility was put in place to provide equitable access to countries rich or poor, to people rich or poor, to COVID-19 vaccines. And while it remains to be seen whether this will fully work out, I think the recent weeks were very promising. It took exactly 86 days between the first vaccine that was provided by one of the developed countries until the first vaccine was provided to Ghana, in this case, a so-called subsidized country that was basically coming through the COVAX facility. By now, about 10 million, this was about 10 days ago now, by now about 10 million vaccines have been provided to 15 countries in this region, for example, to Cambodia. And I'm not saying that we have achieved a total or perfect equity and equality. This will not be possible as long as there is sovereign states having their own power to purchase vaccines. But I think it mitigates the power of the market and the competition between different countries that could have driven the price of the vaccines also much further up. So I think we are having here a fantastic facility. By yesterday, the financing was almost, I think, insured. The layout at this point in time was about $7.7 billion to provide 2+ billion vaccines. And by yesterday, it was 6.3 billion financed. So I think this is an example of how important the multilateral system is in today's world. And with the big challenges of the SDGs and development ahead of us, we need full cooperation from all the member states. Thank you.
Thank you. We have taken more time, but I thought it's a unique opportunity to have Mr. Stefan and Cik Kode from the EPU to set the stage on the status. I think look out for two important reports that will come out in the early part of this year. The voluntary national review that the Malaysian government would publish that would have the achievements, challenges, and the way forward. I think the other that at some point the government would release is the 12th Malaysia Plan, which is from 2021 to 2025. I think raising Francis' question now, the 12th Malaysia Plan for 5 years, and before 2030, there will be the 13th Malaysia Plan as well. So there are 10 years, and I think not only parliamentarians, but all of us should take the full society approach to review, monitor, provide input to ensure that Malaysia would not be left behind. No Malaysian would be left behind. No persons in our society and context be left behind. But with the support of the government, civil society, academia, and especially, as Mr. Stefan mentioned just now, private sector that has the capacity to address almost 45% of financing for SDGs, then a large burden onto the private sector as well to finance. So with those words, please give a hand to Mr. Stefan and to Cik Kode for their valuable input and to set the stage for today. And back to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Datuk Dr. Denison, Jayasooria, and distinguished members of our panel. Let's give them a hand, ladies and gentlemen.